History's most famous psychology study failed to deliver any scientific breakthrough. The world was tricked for decades by a calculated, deceptive performance. We grew up believing power corrupts ordinary people. Actually, the reality is more disturbing. These monsters were simply following a pre-written script. In August 1971, Stanford University hosted a psychological study that changed how textbooks teach human behavior. This controversial experiment explored the psychological effects of perceived power. Zimbardo's infamous Stanford prison experiment claimed to reveal the inherent potential for human cruelty within ordinary individuals under systemic pressure. For 50 years, academics thought they were observing genuine, unscripted human behavior in real time. They argued that specific environmental pressures can drive stable people to commit horrific acts. Psychologists use this story to explain the systemic roots of incidents like police brutality and corporate corruption. Looking back from 2006, these structural failures are no longer subtle, they have become massive, undeniable breaks in the system. This experiment didn't just spiral into chaos. The simulation lacked the basic scientific rigor and controlled methodology needed to support such massive, unproven claims. We are investigating the Stanford basement to uncover what actually happened behind those closed doors during the recent investigation. Researchers built the stage inside a 3-5-foot section of the Stanford Psychology Department basement. They renamed the location Stanford County Jail to make the whole thing feel real. The team recruited participants by running an ad in the local newspaper. Researchers offered male students $15 daily to participate in a study about prison life. This payment was intended to incentivize the college-age participants for their involvement. That equals about $11,1925 in today's money. Psychology professor Philip Zimbardo recruited a group of young men to participate in his famous study. Some records claim 24 participants were chosen, but 18 healthy young men actually took part. Researchers randomly assigned students to play either prisoners or guards during the study, creating two distinct groups for observation. Researchers originally intended to conduct this simulation for a full 2 weeks. The experiment was designed as a 2-week simulation of a prison environment to examine the effects of situational variables on participants' reactions and behaviors. Zimbardo acted as the prison warden rather than just watching from the sidelines, actively participating in the unfolding chaos. Researchers gave guards specific gear to increase their authority. These dark sunglasses stripped away their individual identities, helping the group act like a single, unstoppable force. Scientists asked if prison brutality came from dispositional factors, specifically the sadistic personalities of the guards, or if the behavior was situational caused by the harsh, restrictive environment itself. The violence escalated quickly. Guards used psychological pressure and physical threats to keep the prisoners under control during those weeks, intensifying the atmosphere of fear. The prisoners reacted with visible emotional breakdowns and started organized acts of rebellion. Researchers ended the experiment early after the guards' systemic abuse of prisoners became uncontrollable and escalated beyond the original study scope. But the shutdown actually stems from personal motives, not just what scientific reports claim. Zimbardo ended the experiment early because his girlfriend stepped in, calling the study unethical and deeply problematic. This move proved the researcher had lost his own objectivity. He focused so much on administrative warden duties that he completely missed the actual physical damage occurring within the facility. For decades, people called this a spontaneous breakdown of social order. However, recent investigations show the chaos was actually planned. Researchers criticized the Stanford prison experiment for its flawed methods and lack of experimental control. Recent studies show participants mostly mimicked behaviors they believed the researchers were looking for during the trials. The guards didn't just turn bad, they were trained to be aggressive. Staff members actively manipulated the situation, causing the prisoners to react to the changes. This discovery forces us to rethink how much the situation actually dictates behavior. This post often Cetterall often buys, and you have view of the results show the experiment failed to prove situations change people. It actually showed that you can coach people into specific roles. These new revelations are fundamentally changing how researchers approach modern psychological science. Dominic Packer and Jay Van Bavel reveal what really happened in that Stanford basement, exploring how the study largely debunks one of the cornerstone studies of modern psychology. If the very foundation of how we view authority is fake, what else can we trust? This groundbreaking experiment shapes how we fundamentally understand the dynamics of current wars and the sudden, recent government collapses seen today. People often use Zimbardo's logic to explain the systemic nature of the Abu Ghraib abuses. People blame the system for everything, but if the Stanford model was just a performance, we are ignoring the specific intent and individual responsibility behind those actual actions. Watch out for these iconic stories. If a narrative feels too perfect or too terrifying, it is likely a manufactured lie. The space danger went beyond basement behavior. This lie actually distorted how the world understood human nature for 50 years, influencing global psychology and social science research throughout the mid-20th century. It taught us to fear the system, but ignored the people who actually designed those systems to fail. New evidence shows researchers actively encouraged participants to act with more aggression. The commanders ordered guards to use intimidation tactics to keep the crowd in line. Researchers didn't just stumble into this psychological pressure. They used it as a specific teaching method to force the study to produce dramatic results. The simulation was designed to examine the effects of situational variables on behavior, but the guards' abuse of the prisoners eventually went too far. Both sides manipulated the situation, fueling a cycle of fake conflict. The researchers did not just watch the social phenomenon, they actively directed a highly controlled experimental theatrical production. Without a control group, we cannot tell if social influence or external prompting caused the result. Without a baseline, this data has no real scientific value. The participants acted like actors following unwritten cues, performing scripted movements without explicit instruction. This proves the results weren't a spontaneous reaction to the new setting, but rather a pre-existing behavioral pattern. This heavy-handed intervention shows they are clearly hunting for extreme outcomes. Zimbardo of Think to Bag, the study became part of psychology lore, but its findings have been grossly distorted through overly simplistic interpretations. The deception went beyond simple oversight. The researchers built their entire methodology around the fundamentally broken and flawed structural design. The study's findings were based on the behaviors and reactions of participants in a simulated environment rather than standardized metrics. This controversial study has been largely debunked, revealing that its famous findings were not as definitive as once believed. This leaves people doubting whether famous psychological studies can actually be replicated today. Trust breaks down in any study using high-stakes, high-emotion simulations to prove points. We need to look at the era of big science in psychology with much more skepticism. We need to stop treating researchers like celebrities and start demanding actual, verifiable transparency. The basement experiment shows how easily confirmation bias ruins scientific design and ruins your results. Researchers trying to prove a specific theory often accidentally create the exact evidence they wanted to find. New evidence shows the chaos didn't stem from innate aggression. Instead, researchers specifically instructed guards to use more force during the study. This directive fundamentally changed how people acted in the simulation. By imposing strict constraints, it made observing truly natural behavior impossible. Because the experimental instructions were so explicit, participants obeyed authority figures instead of reacting to the actual physical environment around them, prioritizing commands over their own sensory perceptions. Old internal emails show they cared more about a good story than facts. Researchers chose sensationalism instead of scientific accuracy. This obsession with drama meant reporters ignored any data contradicting their narrative. They simply left out peaceful interactions or omitted them from the final reports entirely, choosing sensationalism over accuracy. The methodology lacked safeguards to prevent researcher interference. This oversight let personal biases dictate how the experiment actually progressed. Because researchers taught guards how to exert control, the study measured obedience to specific commands. It stopped being an investigation into how situational power works, shifting instead toward measuring direct compliance. Because researchers skipped blind testing, participants knew the expected results. This bias fundamentally skewed the data through a massive demand characteristics effect. People subconsciously matched their behavior to what they thought the researchers wanted. They basically tried to play the specific roles the experimenters expected. This cycle turned the basement into a loop of reinforced behavior. Staff feedback essentially dictated how the subjects acted during the study. Scientists now have to face the fact that this study was actually just propaganda for one specific psychological theory. The field's reputation is badly damaged. We need independent oversight for high-impact social simulations to prevent future errors. We need to look at how unverified anecdotes shape this error. Relying on personal observations instead of hard data caused the mistake to spread. This study matters less for its data and more as a warning. It shows how chasing clout can actually ruin scientific integrity and corrupt the entire research process. Ethics committees now use these specific failures to enforce stricter protocols. High-intensity social manipulation without oversight is finally ending. Reconstructing these events corrects the academic record. This shift prioritizes empirical evidence and verifiable, repeatable data over previous, unproven historical assumptions that once dominated the field. Science history is really just a long record of us fixing our biggest errors. If this analysis changed your perspective, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. I investigate the facts behind recent headlines, revealing stories that textbooks often omit or ignore. What is your take? Was the experiment a scientific failure or a deliberate deception? Drop a comment below. Keep up with the news, and I will see you in our next video.